The assassination of Charlie Kirk has resulted in an attack on the First Amendment. There has been a variety of individuals who have been canceled, who have been silenced, covering this assassination in some ways very innocuously and comedic monologues and what have you. And in some ways, this has led to the questioning of where these rights come from and how sacrosanct they are. We need to have a bigger conversation about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights.
I like that you made a distinction between the Constitution and the Bill of Rights because in reality, they are separate documents. And the reason that they are separate documents that we've bound together and in some ways consider, the Bill of Rights to be amendments to the Constitution, but it's not like they strike out any words or replace any articles or sections of the actual Constitution. And even more so, the Constitution was written as an agreement between states.
Whereas the Bill of Rights is more at the individual level. It's not talking about the rights of states, it's talking about the rights of individuals within the states. But the people that lived within the states, they were supposed to be citizens of those states.
Yes, the first argument and the first settled argument in the Constitutional Convention was whether the what we now call the federal government was to be a federal or a national government. And by that argument, they meant is this Constitution that we're writing to bring all of these states together, is it to have control over the citizens of those states? And that first argument was decided, no, this is going to be federal. And by federal, it's going to be what that means is that is going to be a union of states that come together for commerce. But those individual states are going to have their own democratic Republican constitutions, and those states are going to have the power over things like religion, and they're going to decide what it's okay to say and what it's not okay to say, and what the terms of imprisonment or debt relief and all of these other things that the Bill of Rights then purports to or assumes the power of. And so, as the Bill of Rights was introduced at the end of the Constitutional Convention, there were many who said, no, 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 this is a very bad idea, because we will create a backdoor for this federal government to assume national powers. And this is what we have seen occur over and over and over in the history of America. We have.
So what they feared to have happen, we're actually witnessing it happen in real time.
I mean, every time that we have a catastrophe or a cause for concern, a tragedy, any of those things, then the federal government gains national power. And this doesn't just happen in 9/11 or in World War I or World War II, at the Civil War. No, this goes back to almost immediately after the Constitution is adopted. By the War of 1812, James Madison, who had been so against the Bill of Rights, says, "Oh, this is inexorable. The federal government does have national power, and we're just going to have to take a road of being careful about how the federal government exercises that power."
And when we think about the rights that the original authors of the Constitution had written down, they said these rights were inalienable and that they were granted by God. The way that this has played out in the minds of many, I think, is that we no longer had God arbitrating this Constitution, but rather it was almost like the Supreme Court was doing this, because we'd have these fights about what these rights would be about. It would get kicked up to the Supreme Court, and then these judges who were appointed for life were supposed to be impartial and would be the arbiters of this document, but they are political beasts who have been, over time, just doing whatever they feel is right based on their political persuasions.
Well, some rights were unalienable, but the Bill of Rights went beyond or defined rights beyond those that were first put forth to be unalienable. But um, that is a blurry line. We should also begin to think about, what is this thing that we talk about called a right? Because there's an assumption made today that that a right exists, but that forgets Chekhov's gun. What's going to force these people to honor rights? How do rights work in the world? And getting on social media and complaining about something or canceling somebody because you don't agree with how they're behaving or whose rights that they're honoring doesn't get you very far. So we did have this original idea that there were going to be state governments and they were going to work against the federal government and work against each other, and the federal government was going to enshrine liberty or the ability to move from these various states with their own rules with regards to what they could force people to do. But you're right in pointing out that as that distinction melted away so very early, we turned to the judiciary instead to make that determination. But as we see the once highly regarded Supreme Court justices now under constant scorn, constantly questioned, their logic, their debates no longer held so aloft and away from the ears and the minds of the American people.
That happened pretty rapidly in the way that this played out. We for a while, for several decades, we had a balanced court. It was almost split 50-50. Democrats and Republicans, or at least those who had been appointed by Democratic and Republican presidents. Then when Obama failed to appoint a judge and we had a mostly Republican Supreme Court, and then when Trump got more and more appointees, the court looked like it was completely biased and no longer impartial. I think that's when it really started to get eroded.
Well, yeah, it became more noticeable. But if we go back and look at the decisions of the Supreme Court, as far back as Taney, John Marshall, from the outset, the arguments that were put forth by the Supreme Court pick which conversation that the Constitution is, which conversation the Constitution is having between states or between the people. It picks the it picks the verses that it wants to make its case, and then they take a look at the American public and see what they can get away with. And I would say that the rise of social media, of the original check in the Constitution of how a democracy was to operate was to have a post office so that people could communicate, talk amongst themselves. We have that even with the problems of the social media platforms. We have that social media platforms and censorship, I should say, in more power in the hands of the people than we ever have in the past, and that has eroded the authority of the Supreme Court broadly.
And the mechanisms of social media don't seem that dissimilar from what used to happen with newspapers. I mean, things were getting published pretty quickly. Like things would get written, they'd get published the next day. It doesn't feel that dissimilar to what is happening now with social media as to what was happening in smaller jurisdictions with the papers that were being printed and published and the pamphlets that were getting pushed out.
Well, and if we go back and look, say, during the Civil War, or even into the 1890s, there used to be a lot more newspapers, lots of small newspapers, lots of pamphlets, even in the Revolutionary War. We've lived maybe since the 1950s at a time whenever there was a conglomeratization, and part of that conglomeratization may have had the fingers of the government behind it because it was more easily to control the narratives coming out. But this is always, an oscillating wheel in the history of, I'd say, all governments. Going back to Gutenberg, but there is, as we have more people begin to understand understand what's going on with the government, uh, and to be concerned about transgressions to the rights of Americans as they see promised to them by the Bill of Rights written into the Constitution. I think that we're going to see the power of the Democrats at least rising in the coming future.
And part of this we already see with the fight that's happening in California, with the governor of California starting to be at odds with the federal government, picking a fight. This is how do we see this ending up? Is like when they actually throw out the ICE agents from California, and then this is when we see the fight really ramping up.
Well, I think that's exactly what we're going to see. I think we're going to see governors of the states. We've already seen Gavin Newsom take Trump to court with regards to who controls the National Guard. The National Guard is, again, the federal government's not a national government. The National Guard is a name that's given to a I didn't even know how to put it, a federalization of the national militias, and the states have that national power. And though the broad understanding of the United States citizen has moved towards, oh, the federal government does have these national powers, as they don't get along, as we see different areas of the country, different groups of people not getting along, we're going to see a fracturing of this national identity at the federal government or the union level. And the likes of Gavin Newsom taking Trump to court with regards to control over California's militia is just the start of it. The next step that we're going to see is a governor like Gavin Newsom or Michelle Lujan Grisham in New Mexico, or maybe some Democratic governor in Texas who gets elected because the people of Texas, the farmers in Texas need their cheap labor, and other people in Texas have many relationships with their families in Mexico and friends from Mexico who've lived here in Texas, and they say, why do people in Washington D.C. get to tell me who my neighbors are? And so that is a fight that is coming here in America, and we're going to go back to scratching our heads and saying, wait, does the Constitution make the federal government a national government, or is it a union of national states?
Well, and we're also seeing this with some of the things that Trump has been saying, where he said, I can do whatever I want, and I can send the military into these various states and cities to preserve order and some of the other threats that have been happening here. This seems to be where the fight is going and where Trump is taking the fight.
I mean, I've also been very interested in Trump's sending the federal standing army into states, and this is also when I begin to say, they tell themselves that they take an oath to the Constitution, but nobody in the United States, or very few people, think about this complexity in the Constitution, and how is that struggle between service members, people who are in the armed forces, how are they going to deal with that? It's easy to obey the chain of command when it's outside the borders of the United States. I think it's going to get a lot more fraught whenever they're being dispatched to locations inside the United States, and Trump is talking about doing more of this. He wants to send troops into various red states, and he's talking about fighting the cartels in Venezuela. Okay, he's dispatched several ships to the sea north of Venezuela. What happens whenever that's along the southern border of the United States? And what
I
happens if
find it I find it pretty interesting about some of the reactions that people are having to the cancellation of voices regarding discussions of Charlie Kirk. We're already seeing a massive boycott of Disney, which owns the channel that he was operating under. It's like there's an immediate reaction and an immediacy to what's going on in the world right now. The people are finding their voice in some ways and saying, if it's a corporation that is trampling on our rights, that are trampling on the freedoms that we have, we're just going to immediately stop doing business with them. And we saw this with the way that people reacted to Target when they reacted in a way that they felt was, pandering to Donald Trump. And if this is the same kind of a thing where we see Disney take a substantive hit because they're pandering to the federal government and what Donald Trump wants, I don't know. I almost view that as a good thing. Like, the more the individuals and the people are exercising the power of their rights and their ability to talk to power, it seems like a positive thing in the United States.
Well, we've had this, we've maintained this capitalist narrative that the private sector is separate from government, but part of that has lived on these liberal notions of global corporations, of this separation between the government and the private sector. But Trump's government is in taking a stake in Intel, is nationalizing countries, is moving towards fair trade instead of free trade. And this is where I think we also begin to turn back and think about, um, the original notion was that there were going to be sovereign states that got a say in religion. The Establishment Clause in the Constitution, not in the Bill of Rights, or no, I'm sorry, in the Bill of Rights, in the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause forbids the federal government from establishing a religion, but it doesn't. Some of the states that entered into the federal union had already established their own religions. Maryland was a Catholic state. Uh, Rhode Island had their own religion. Pennsylvania was a state of Quakers. With these ideas of religion, says, oh, that state gets to have some sort of say in what's in what are in people's minds or thoughts, or what they're allowed to say. So th- that that
I think with that, we are going to see people starting to gravitate towards states that more align with their political persuasions. We have seen this with some of what happened when Roe versus Wade was struck down at the federal level, and now we have states starting to weigh in on this, and we have somewhat seen an exodus from various different states where people say, I really don't agree with the politics of Texas or other places that have said that, abortion isn't something that is allowed. And then you have young people and young women leaving and saying, well, I feel oppressed. I feel like I can't live in this state anymore. And so you're starting to see a real demographic swing based on politics. If we start to see a lot more of this, then we're going to start to see states start to have a very particular persuasion. And I find that, if this was something that happened early in the Constitution and the way that the Union was formed, then we're starting to see it resonate even more these days.
And Minnesota, I think about Minnesota and immigration, the sort of the very liberal Lutheran, the very liberal Lutheranism. And I grew up a Lutheran in a maybe a more Methodist or Baptist state like Texas. Um, I think we're going to. I think you're absolutely right that we will see people doubling down and moving to places that they're aligned with the religious communities that are in that state. I also think too about the growth of Islam. Um, a there's a pushback, which I always find ironic, from from evangelicals, from people who strongly identify as Christian, want to see some sort of Christian nationalism, whatever that might be, and they push back against Sharia law and Islam. But I'm always interested when I see that, and I think, well, in some ways they're reacting to something that they actually want to see, but they want to see that expressed in their religious ideas being expressed in the laws of their state. And we have muzzled that interpretation of that power being in the hands of the various states.
So what you're saying is they're really not that far apart. If it's Christian nationalisms or Muslims who are expressing Sharia law, that these things are kind of kissing cousins, that they're not that far apart. Is that what you're kind of getting at there?
Yeah, they see Sharia law, and honestly, what they're really saying is like, why can't I have that? Why why can't we have Christian ideals embodied in the law here? And again, if we go back to the original concept of what the union was gonna
Charlie
look like,
Kirk was
they were to
kind
have
of Charlie Kirk was kind of saying these types of things, if I recall. He was very much trying to espouse that there should be more Christian nationalism and the state should be expressing more of this.
absolutely, and this is what I was most fascinated with Charlie Kirk, but I also, um, I was wary of the success of his message because it did not include the nuance of the complexity of the state national governments, because Charlie Kirk, when he spoke about Christian nationalism, he spoke about the United States as a whole, as a nation, and as like we were going to enforce some notion of Christian nationalism or a religious theocracy at the federal level. And I agree that we should have the religious mores related to I'm not down with this whole notion of the separation of church and state. I think that is a very bankrupt idea, but I am about decentralization, and I think this is the cusp of what we're moving into in not just the American political conversation, but also the a European political conversation too, as they are grappling with the European Union over the various nationalist governments, Romania, Hungary, etc. Um, these nationalist governments are going to win out, and I think for people who are worried about the implications of what sort of religious values or rules that these religious communities are making, should not be turning to a federal or a centralized solution to their problems of some piece of paper written hundreds of years ago as protecting them. What they should be turning to is to more fracture and more sovereignty, more autonomy, smaller states and more states. That's what the answer in the future is going to look like.
Less of this homogenous United States that we've had, more of what it looked like when the Constitution was originally written, that the states had a tremendous amount of power and the federal government was only a document that was to govern the interplay between them, the commerce between the states, the rules that would govern how you would move between them. This was, I think, what the states were thinking about when they said, well, it's okay to have a federal government, but very limited one.
Yes, and when I see Trump's turning to fair trade, and eh, I think that part of what makes a notion of the fair trade ideals work against free trade is this nuance and sovereignty of different states throughout the world, and so it may give people who see the answer to fairness in the world as one one great monolithic contract and monolithic document, constitution, or whatever charter gets written down as being as being a protection. I don't think that's the way of the future. And so when I look at Trump and both fair trade, and I also think about the we haven't talked about this, but part of the the bucolic or original America was one of monetary complexity. Um, and I think actually that gold and silver eroded the independence of the various states, and was a flaw in the original design of the country. But part of why I'm so interested um, in blockchains, in peer-to-peer uh, databases that people can trust in, is because it gives us a tool to have more of this complexity, um, w- without relying too much on bookkeepers. Um, and so I think what we're also going to see, and we've already seen a whole lot of movements toward, are states beginning to also gain independence from the federal government. And this now, I'm not even sure how many trillions of dollars of debt that we're currently at. Seems to be ticking up at an alarming rate. Um, but this is
So,
going.
so how does this bode for the future of the Constitution if we start to see the fracturing of the homogenous United States that many of us grew up with, many of us experienced when we were younger? If we start to see these things come about, the state constitutions will probably be more foremost on the minds of the individuals of people that live in these various jurisdictions, because now these state constitutions are going to matter much more if the federal government wanes in power.
I, I think that the Constitution matters less as a founding document, and that people will turn towards the Declaration of Independence as being as being a starting point of identity. And we even saw this. This has historical precedence, I should say. When Lincoln made a case um, for 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 starting the Civil War, or for having a civil war, or forcing states to remain in the Union, he did so um, by invoking some of the other founding documents of the United States. And though we all focus on the Constitution for the last couple of hundred years, we had Articles of Confederation, we had the Declaration of Independence, we had the letter written to King George about the I forget what the title of the letter is, or what we call it, but the problems of King George and the British monarchy. So I think that we turn to those documents, or at the very least the preamble of the Constitution. I mentioned the Bill of Rights as being problematic, or being a bone of contention between the framers of the Constitution, and debates being held about the validity of a Bill of Rights. There were many of the framers who said, this is a document, a conversation between states. The appropriate place for the bills of rights are to be in the state constitutions, but also the preamble. When Governor Morris wrote the preamble and brought it back, many of the framers, including Franklin, Benjamin Franklin was very adamant about this. He said it should say "we the states," not "we the people." Well, if any Americans know, some lines of the Constitution, they really focus on the preamble of the Constitution. And so I think we can hold on to some of these other founding documents and the ideas espoused in them, and it's not going to be that destabilizing to say, I'm going to do away. I'm not going to be so concerned with Articles 2, 3. I mean, who even thinks about Article 3 of the Constitution and how problematic that is today? Um, uh, that was never mind. I don't want to get too far, but short answer to your question is we have a whole lot of founding documents, and there's some really good ideas in them. So we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
I don't know that we've come to a strong conclusion, but it's definitely a conversation about what has occurred in the wake of the assassination of Charlie Kirk. It's interesting that he was assassinated so close to another landmark event in the United States, which was 9/11. So now we have 9/10 and 9/11. I think that historically we're going to look back on both of these events as very significant for the ramifications of what would happen as a result of these events in later years and later decades. We're seeing it play out in real time in front of us. I look towards the longer term as well. I think that it's going to have a pretty substantive impact on what happens in the midterms as well as the next election and on the balance of power. Any final thoughts on what we've discussed today beyond that?
You know, the one thing that we haven't talked about with regards to Charlie Kirk's assassination are some of the revelations that are coming out about the amount of influence that money had on Turning Point USA. And I say that with thoughts towards the Tea Party and the MAGA movements in the political movements in the United States, and how they have been so focused on getting away from big money in their campaigns. So as we begin to realize that Turning Point USA may have been an avenue into money entering entering into this political revolution going on in the United States, I think that's going to be interesting. I know we've got to wrap up, so maybe we'll save that for an upcoming episode. But we are headed to an age-old fight about the nature of rights, of liberties, and freedom here in the United States. So let's not get trapped into or pigeonholed into a notion that that the Constitution is the end all be all of ending arguments about what our liberties are or how broad they should be.
All right, and we'll see you next time on FOMO.